Good morning, everyone. My name is Regina Fodden, and I'm welcoming you to a session called Visualizing Sites in the City Too Busy to Hate, Atlanta Case Studies in Outreach and Digital Interpretation with Danielle Willkens. But I'll just turn it right over to Danielle. But thank you for joining us, and I'm sure it's going to be an intriguing presentation. Thank you. Oh, wrong way.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I will share my screen here as we bear with me with the fun internet world we have. Apologies. It's not. There we go.
Hold on.
All right. Do I have a shared screen here? Hopefully now.
Yes.
You've got.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Excellent. And I've got a bit of an echo. All right. So hopefully you're seeing my full screen.
I can. Yep.
Okay. And just to confirm, I do have an echo there.
Okay. I'm muted. I'm not quite sure what to do there unless you want to mute. I'm not sure what to do there. Try it again. I'm going to mute myself and see if that's the problem.
Okay. So let's see if we'll just jump in here. All right. What I'm going to be talking about today, and thank you very much for having me, is a course that I ran this spring. Sorry, there's still an echo there. But this is in Atlanta. We'll give it a shot, see how this goes. This is in Atlanta. I'm speaking from the School of Architecture at Georgia Tech. I'm really sorry. There's still a really bad echo.
Hi there, it's Carol from Socio. I don't hear an echo on our side.
All right, let's.
I think our speaker has left to see if she can get rid of that echo, so she'll be right back. Thank you for holding on.
All right, let's hopefully that will work. Do you have audio from me? And hopefully you're seeing my screen. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. All right.
Is that better?
Yes, yes, yes. All right, and we're live?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I enjoy being someone who works quite a bit with technology, and then when we have a moment, the technology doesn't work. So, as I said, I'm speaking to you from Georgia Tech School of Architecture, where I had the privilege of leading a course that was investigating some sites in Atlanta that have not received the attention that they have due. And part of this was about kind of demystifying some digital technology for students in terms of 3D scanning and aerial photogrammetry. But another part was to get students essentially out in the community and visible within what otherwise can be an academic bubble in a large metropolitan area. Georgia Tech's neighbors to the west are a historically underserved, predominantly African-American neighborhood, consisting of the English Avenue area and Vine City, part of which you're seeing here. The main road that you're looking down towards Mercedes-Benz Stadium is Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. And the image that we have on the right shows you the historic site of Pascal's, which was featured in the Green Book. The smaller site, the lower portion, was actually the famous restaurant where travelers would stop. Iconically, it is the last place where John Lewis said he saw Martin Luther King Jr. Alive. And then there was the hotel and essentially a street nightclub behind it. And this is part of a documentation project to record a structure that is kind of precariously hanging on what we would call in the demolition by neglect realm, and also a chance to really start a dialogue in the city about preservation and memory and these sites that are really significant to the city's history. So I want to present a little bit about the course and really kind of two case studies, but invite everyone to hopefully explore the work that's happening there and to continue this dialogue that we're trying to have in the city. Lots of this is kind of legacies of slavery, as we see in other metropolitan areas. So even though we may be talking about sites from the 20th century, we can certainly tie it into conversations about forcible oppression and consciously underserved communities that are tied to, particularly in the South, the legacy of enslavement and the Jim Crow South. So students were able to select a series of sites in Atlanta, and they landed on the kind of set that is here. And the course was in the spring of 2021. It was an elective seminar made of undergraduate and graduate students, and they were able to work in small teams and essentially propose a project for these sites, whether that was a digital documentation project, a kind of public outreach intervention, of whatever the site needed. They were able to propose that for the particular site, and a lot of the work is actually continuing. So even though that was one particular semester, we definitely have boots on the ground with a number of the sites as we continue even today. So it's very exciting to see the investment that has happened in these places, particularly from the student perspective, and the enthusiasm that they had for investigating these places that really are in kind of their backyards as students, or maybe a site that they wouldn't have had the opportunity to really delve into otherwise. One of the startup exercises that we used for the course was very much inspired by the incredible Monuments Lab, and their poster series was one that we used as kind of a Kickstarter and asked the students to dig into that and start to make kind of conversation pieces around issues that they saw in and around Atlanta. So you're seeing the result of some of those here. That were really just a way to get in and leverage the students' graphic capabilities that fortunately we have when we talk about a School of Architecture. So how do we take research? How do we take key questions and actually bring those into a visual component that can maybe allow others to interface with it. Whereas if it's left purely as sort of a textual presentation, it's not something that feels as acceptable, or perhaps there might even be things that are quite provocative within some of these images. So within the Paper Monuments kind of project, as I said, inspired by Monuments Lab, this was a good way to kind of kickstart work and kickstart some of the questions that we were going to go over in the course. So as I said, I pulled out 2 projects from the 8 in the class that I wanted to share just in terms of what's going on at these sites and kind of where we're headed. The first of which, both of these projects are on the west side of Atlanta in the English Avenue neighborhood. And English Avenue was formerly known as Western Heights. It was predominantly a white middle-class neighborhood out of speculative development from James English Jr. His father had been a Confederate officer and would be mayor of Atlanta in the 1881 to 1883. We might think of sort of some of his policies as progressive in terms of saying that there was going to be paid fire departments and paved roads, but it was actually quite a self-serving attitude in that English Sr. owned the Chattahoochee Brick Company, which there is an incredible history waiting to be written there, but unfortunately, like a lot of other Jim Crow era companies in the South, it was built upon the back of convict leasing labor. They were making bricks, about 200,000 a day, that were then sold across the Southeast and used in a variety of projects. So the kind of literal fingerprints of these workers are around the cities that we inhabit. And as he was using these convict leasing labor systems, he was actually using older brick making technology. So they're hand-done bricks. They're actually distinctive for the time, even though a lot of these buildings are from the early 20th century. So that's kind of the context of English Avenue. And it was a neighborhood that went from that kind of middle-class white neighborhood as demographics shifted in the 30s and 40s in Atlanta, tied to white flight as well. This particular neighborhood became a predominantly African-American neighborhood. And so what was built, what you're looking at here in 1911, originally as a white school as part of an Atlanta school bond, then transformed into an equalization school. And in 1960, it was bombed. In the 90s, it was entirely decamped, and today it sits abandoned, unfortunately. The project was listed on the National Register of Historic Sites in 2020, and there are plans for redevelopment at the site to essentially turn this into a community center. There's still, if we were to turn around in this image, we would have houses behind us, so it's still a very vibrant community. And every time we've been on site for documentation, we're asked questions, or if we happen to know what the status is of project updates. But we've been working with the owners of the site to see it using 3D scanning, photogrammetry, and photography, and then also really leveraging the students' skills in design and architectural drawing to create a set of drawings to the Historic American Building Survey standards, or HABs. So this is an example of the facades. So it's a quite incredible building. It holds a really rich story. It has pretty spectacular alumni as well. While it was an elementary school, Gladys Knight actually attended this school. And so we wanted to make sure that if nothing else, we could really add to the documentary record of the site. And as you can see from the interior, portions of that 1911 school, which is the center bay, and additions that occurred later in the 20s are not in the best of conditions. So unfortunately, a lot of this is a documentation project, and hopefully will be a renovation. but we're trying to capture what we are available in the moment. So this is allowing students to, again, get in, use the technology, use their skills as design students to record a place that is important and needs to be seen and shown, and hopefully be part of its transformation. So physically being in the community, active, and participating in what we hope will be a rehabilitation project. And you can see here we've been using drones in particular to study the roof, and that the roof plan actually very clearly shows you the original 1911 building in the center, and then the wings that were added, the auditorium as well. But we've been using this to study, unfortunately, the building's decline in terms of kind of rate of change, as well as even deflections using 3D scanning. So it's a way for us to tell, what is happening with the facade. And the technologies that we're using, in part, as I said, is to get students familiar with it, but it's also to try to get these technologies into places very much like the Slave Dwelling Project is doing with the recording of preserved dwellings and tenant farms, getting this technology to places that may not have the funds or capabilities to do it otherwise. And as an Institute of Higher Learning, we're very fortunate to have some of those capabilities, and these kind of projects and art are a perfect way to really be present members in our communities to try to leverage some of that technology that otherwise wouldn't be accessible to them. These kind of drone surveys or 3D scanning projects can cost tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, in terms of what needed to happen on site and then the processing off site. So these are quite expensive endeavors, but when done within an educational institution, they become opportunities for educational engagement. The second site that we're looking at is just south, and you can see the stone shell here in the foreground, and then the skyline of Atlanta in the background, in particular, kind of Mercedes-Benz, which is an orientation point in the city, allowing you to understand where you are based on how large that structure is. But the project that is in the foreground there is St.Mark AME, and you'll see it's just a stone shell at this point in time. And this is another building that really tells the story of shifting demographics and interests within Atlanta. This originally started when it was constructed in 1919 as Western Heights Baptist Church. The congregation sponsored the building after they had outgrown a wooden structure and decided that they wanted a more permanent, more resilient structure, especially given the Great Fire of Atlanta in 1917, that prompted the community to think a little bit more about materials that would be resistant to fire. But the structure they went with was a stone and granite, so of the kind of famous Stone Mountain to the east of the city. There are a few structures within Atlanta that are composed of Stone Mountain granite. So this is, it is unique in many ways, but that was a material palette that was available. And the structure was used by Western Heights Baptist Church, that white congregation, for about 20 years. And it was right along, so the street that you're seeing here actually would have had a streetcar line, one of the main streetcar lines that ran in Atlanta between 1880s and 1949 when it was torn out. And that streetcar line, it was distinguished in the sense that Georgia was one of the first states to pass Jim Crow legislation that prohibited or that segregated streetcars. So this was a place for, unfortunately, only the white citizens to move in and about the city. As demographics shifted in the 30s and 40s, the inhabitants of Western Heights Baptist Church decided to actually move their congregation. The building was left until it was sold to St.Mark AME, which had previously been south of the city along what is now known as Martin Luther King Jr. And they moved to this site after their church was quite suspiciously burned in the summer of 1948. So they were able to take up residence within this structure, and it became a very productive home until the 70s. At that point in time, the streetcar had been gone. As you can see, it's a sort of residential neighborhood with only street parking, and so transportation became an issue. And the inhabitants decided to actually move outside of the city, outside of the 285 loop, to a new congregation, which is where they still are today. So St. Mark's kind of once again left abandoned, and unfortunately became a bit of an icon within what was known as the Bluffs, which was a heavily trafficked drug area of Atlanta in the late 70s and into the 90s. Pastor Winston Taylor purchased the site in the mid 90s. And at that point in time, the roof was essentially collapsed, the interior very dilapidated, excuse me, and he was able to really strip down the interior and reveal that stone shell. And since '95, he has been pioneering some interesting programming at the site, added some infill to it to protect the stone foundation, so the level's a little bit higher, about a half a story higher than it would have been. And he's thinking about, what is the future of the site here? So we've been very fortunate through that race and space course in the summer to work with Pastor Taylor and talk about and kind of envision what maybe some interiors could look like for this structure. There is a new land use framework plan that was approved by the city in 2017 that would facilitate the insertion of some sort of programming to this site in an area which is essentially a service desert. So the program that we were charged to investigate was a library. And I think it was particularly glaring as we continue through this kind of COVID epidemic that simple things like access to Wi-Fi were necessities in the neighborhood. And so if there was a site like this that would allow the community to come together, potentially still have some outdoor space. So the visions that we've worked together with the students were not just a total infill or capping the building, but thinking about how you can still reveal that stone shell. So moving from the original kind of documentation of it, just like English Avenue, the students were able to 3D scan the space and create a series of representative drawings that show this really intricate mosaic stone mountain granite pattern on the facade, quite a distinctive building in that sense. And with that documentation in hand from the spring, this summer, we had a small studio of senior design students within the Bachelor of Science program take on the charge of positioning some ideas for that site. What could happen at the corner? How could things be reactivated in this area? And within that land use framework plan from 2017, this corner with St. Mark is very much an anchor in thinking about the resiliency of this neighborhood. So students were able to do some studies about what had been at the site, what could be there. Pastor Taylor has been absolutely incredible in terms of inserting a pollinator garden to the area that has spurred some interest and activity there at the site this summer. Students were thinking about, all right, how does this area get used different times of the day, different times of the year? So positioning some questions about what exactly is needed, and had the opportunity to actually talk to community members to try to answer those questions. And then do a series of kind of regulatory studies that led to some of the mappings that you're seeing on the left, and then some of the more exploratory drawings that you're seeing on the right. And trying to visualize how this site is such a unique place and an asset for the community, and how might it be reborn. Part of this is tied into some of the regulations that may need to change. And if we talk about this site as an area that once did have that streetcar and had that public transportation tie, but is now been quite isolated, transportation is at the heart of that question. For anyone who knows Atlanta, this area in general will tie in to the Beltline. But with that connection, that loop that is going to circle Atlanta once it's entirely finished, there's also questions of gentrification that often with development comes displacement, and how does that, how can that be avoided in this neighborhood? And the final image I'll just leave you with is the one of Pascal's, and again that we're kind of keeping an eye on in terms of doing some drone surveys to study the building and how it is changing, a completely abandoned site at this point. A lot of the work that's been going on with students has been to engage them in the dialogue, but then also to have kind of a forward-facing view. So if anyone is interested, you can look up Radical Good Trouble. And I'm very fortunate to be at Georgia Tech, where there are a number of faculty members who are doing this work out in the community and involving students in this. So if you look up that, you'll be able to find the Radical Good Trouble book that was composed by Julie Kim, which has a number of student proposals for the site and envisions, what we can do as a School of Architecture, and one that is hopefully training the next generation of citizen architects to think consciously about their communities and how their work can provide design services for all. So I'm going to turn it over to some questions. I hope we have some questions, and thank you for your time.
All right. I see lots of comments about how interesting the presentation is. I don't see any questions yet.
Okay. And I will stop sharing my screen here. So
okay,
just in case.
Well, I don't need to be at the center here, but anyway.
Yeah, so Joe called out Stone Mountain Granite. Yeah, so there's an interesting story, I think, to be had there that we're just really digging into now as we are learning about the other structures in the city that were made out of Stone Mountain Granite, particularly a large number from the 1890s and early 1900s, really the first 2 decades of the 1900s. And I think one project that I'm particularly interested in as we dig into this is learning that Big Bethel, that may be a familiar structure to people from Atlanta, which is part of Sweet Auburn, the historically African-American area. If you've driven through Atlanta on the highway, you've seen the big mural of John Lewis. Big Bethel is right next door and has the Jesus Saved sign at the top. But that historic AME church is actually made of Stone Mountain Granite. And we've learned that it was made from essentially offcuts. So that congregation, unlike the others in the area that were also using Stone Mountain Granite, were not essentially allowed to purchase the larger cuts of stone to compose the church. And so it's a smaller pattern at Big Bethel. And we're kind of curious to dig into maybe some of the technology to start to map that. And how did a material and a fabrication method actually reflect some of the social structures that were imposed in the city at the time.
Well, Danielle, if you wouldn't mind, have any of your students, any of the projects that have come from after their graduation or what they've been doing, have they stayed in Atlanta? Have they carried on any of the work after their academic experience?
So this is, we're just really, we're less than a year into this. I'm still a fairly new transplant to Atlanta, so have really been enjoying getting to know the city through these endeavors. But the first iteration of the course was in spring 2021. And doing these small projects and doing things that were documenting work outside. We were kind of fortunate in ways that we were able to do that amid COVID and amid kind of cautious work that we were trying to do. But yeah, so some of those projects, so we worked with St. Mark AME in the summer to do the studio. We continue work with St. Mark and work quite closely with Pastor Winston and talking about what the future of that site may be. We've been doing the structural monitoring at the English Avenue building. There's going to be some work in the future at Pascal's. Thankfully, there's a National Center for Preservation Technology and Training grant that came through and will help us sponsor some of that work this spring. I'm very excited to say that a lot of the students from the spring seminar have continued to work on those sites. We had students do podcasts for different areas, and have kind of taken these on now as pet projects that have continued past graduation and past kind of the metrics of a course. So I think that's been really rewarding and exciting to see the students continue their investment in these places. And I think, get them, like I said, outside of the bubble that can often be an architecture school, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, we have a question from Leslie Stanton. Can you envision an Atlanta that truly made this rich and diverse history visible to the public? Maybe a signage program?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do, we launched sort of a small website about the work that was shared as things were developing. I think we would love to have some sort of public outreach or interpretation that gets into the story. More than just even sort of sharing the digital documentation, I think what we're interested in is that for these sites, in particular, like somewhere like English Avenue Elementary School or St. Mark AME, I would say every time we're on site working, and our equipment is not inconspicuous in terms of like the 3D scanning and the drones. But every time we're working, we have people come up to us and tell us stories about what was there or their experience, or at the school, a teacher that they remember who was really transformative to them. So figuring out a way in the future of how do we capture those stories to make sure that they're preserved. That's something that I'm looking to partner with someone in maybe the history department to get some of those oral histories and allow people to tell their stories. And I think that's one of the biggest thing is that there hasn't been a platform for these areas to be recorded and documented and shown what value they have in the city. And that's perhaps something that we can do moving forward. But yeah, the idea of what is the public facing view of this is definitely a big question that we have and hope to push that forward.
Okay. Joe has asked, how did the Black built environment fare during the 1996 Olympics?
That's good question. So in general, there was development in the center of the city. The west side of the city, there were elements, and that's another big project, and an absolutely incredible scholar named Christina Crawford has been working on this. But Atlanta had two parallel housing projects. They were the first in the United States developed, and she's the expert here. But two parallel projects developed. One was for a white citizenry, and the other was for the African American citizenry. And University Homes was part of that, and it was largely torn down. So this really historic structure in terms of the visioning of what public housing could be in the United States was largely torn down for the Olympics. And the other portion of housing that was part of the white neighborhood, some of it actually transitioned into tech housing, tech student housing for a period of time. That was torn down as well. And now a portion of the Olympic Village still exists that is Georgia Tech student housing. But unfortunately, I mean, kind of a predictable story that with development comes displacement, and that often falls on communities of color. You can go to the lining maps and where things are situated and shown as like this is the perfect opportunity for growth and development was a historically African American neighborhood. There's moments that are poised for this to happen again right now as new investments are coming into Atlanta. In particular, Microsoft is coming into the city on the west side, which is both very exciting and also one that we're curious to see how that development and influx is going to shift community and demographics and its resources. How does that change taxes? How does that change property values? And I would say even with speculative development that's happening right now, when you dig into tax records, it's already happening.
Okay. Well, Thank you. Leslie has another question for you. If time permits, can you say a word about how eminent domain has been used to displace Black communities?
Yeah, that's a good question. To be honest, from that aspect, or where we've studied, and in the era that we've studied, a lot of the work is from the early 20th century, and it was eminent domain that was being used. It was essentially the Hulk maps, the homeowners loan corporation, that were being used to essentially segregate the city, where it was very difficult to get a loan in a certain area, and so property value low, and that correlated to what became a predominantly African American portion of the city. That also was exacerbated when Atlanta's highway system grows and develops and does all the strange things that it does in the city, as two major highways meet in the middle of the downtown. So I haven't do the domain question, but that's certainly a good one for us to look into in the future.
Okay. We don't have any more questions at the moment, but anyways, if there's anything in particular, I think you've talked about a few things you're concerned about, the continued development, any other things that people should be thinking about, when they're thinking about Atlanta or other places. I used to live in St. Louis that really suffered from highway development, and that lived on the wrong side of the highway for a while, and that has an effect whether things are changing in that way, whether you see improvement possible,
Definitely. Well, and I think, the Beltline is, this connective corridor has potential to be really transformative on the west side. But also the trend is that the properties along the corridor on the east have radically increased in price, and have kind of driven residents out. Not because, it's a good thing to have property value increase, but that means, your taxes are exponentially increasing. And so if that property becomes sustainable for a homeowner who may not have access to generational wealth or other kind of forms of support, it suddenly caused people to have to move out of the area. I think there's potential for some really exciting development. Mercedes-Benz Stadium was part of that. So placed on the west side, idea that this would create a large number of resources for the community. And there are a few things that have happened, but there's quite more that should happen. And we can certainly see highway systems being, and not even just the interstate, but there are a few key roads in Atlanta that are very stark dividers between councils and resources in those areas.
I think we have time for one more question from Patricia West. Any documentation work being done around the 5 Points area in the Atlanta race riots of 1906? W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about this in the Litany of Atlanta, and I have seen historic articles. Excellent.
Yes. So 5 Points, I know Georgia State is doing some documentation. They're another program that's in the city. They're in town. So they've done some documentation on that side of the city. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the areas that are concerned with some of the early 20th century changes, the race riots, and then even the 1917 fire that really ravaged a part of an African-American community in Vine City, have been visually erased. And so I think that's where digital technologies can be really interesting for us to go back and see if there is documentation of those places, from photographs and writings. How can we kind of do some sort of marker, a visual marker, to show what was there as the city's changed? Atlanta is in my sort of new experience of Atlanta, or as I said, I've been here a few years, is a place that there's a lot of opportunities for sort of sharing these rich stories that are overlooked. So I think that's a great question. That's a great area to explore. A lot of the work so far that we've been doing has been on the west side. in part because Georgia Tech is on the sort of upper portion of the west side, and trying to figure out essentially how do we be better neighbors.
Okay. All right. Well, I said we've just got a couple minutes left, but any final thoughts, Danielle? Or oh, wait a minute. Thank you. It seems to be missing from the education of students who come from that area. So that's from Patricia.
Thank you, Patricia. Yeah. No, I think that was definitely a comment from a lot of the students, and many of who aren't from Atlanta. The course from the spring and from the summer is a kind of mixed demographic, as we would find in a lot of universities, of students from the area or from abroad. So it was just an opportunity to try to learn about the place that they were in and all of its histories that need to be told and shared.
Okay. And Leslie says, thank you for a fascinating presentation.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate your questions and your attention.
Okay. Okay. Well, I said, unless you have another comment or a thought to leave us with, I think we can close out the session, it looks like.
Yeah, I think just please stay tuned. You can find me on Georgia Tech's website. So if you have questions, I would be very curious to hear your thoughts or feedback, and hopefully we'll get some other work out there. So keep an eye out. We've got another iteration of the class coming this spring. So I'll be excited to see what we get up.
All right. Thank you, Danielle, and congratulations on all
Thank
the
you so
good
much.
work, and best of luck to you and your students.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.